9:48 p.m. A car pulls away from a quiet street in Tucson, Arizona. The driver watches the front door close behind an 84-year-old woman. He waits a moment, confirms she is inside, then drives away. That is the last time anyone outside that house sees Nancy Guthrie. What happens in the hours that follow is something the FBI has spent weeks trying to reconstruct from security footage, DNA evidence, and a backpack purchased at Walmart. And the more they find, the more unsettling the picture becomes, because this was not random. Someone had been watching Nancy Guthrie long before that January night. Someone who knew her routines, knew her home, and knew exactly which camera to block. The question that sits at the center of this entire investigation is not just who took her. It is how long they had been planning it, and how close they were to her life before any of this began. Nancy Guthrie is 84 years old. She requires daily medication to function. She cannot walk 50 meters on her own, and according to the FBI, she was taken from her home in the Catalina Foothills neighborhood of Tucson sometime in the early hours of February 1st, 2026. As of today, she has not been found. The FBI has released surveillance footage. They have released images of a backpack. They have collected DNA from two separate locations that do not match each other and match nothing in the National Criminal Database. More than 55,000 tips have come in from across the country, and still no arrest. If you follow true crime investigations, you already know what the FBI says about the first 48 hours after a person goes missing. That window is not a guideline. It is the difference between a rescue and a recovery. In this case, that window opened and closed before most people even knew Nancy was gone. This video is going to walk through every confirmed piece of evidence the FBI and Pima County Sheriff have released, every verified timeline, detail, and every question that remains unanswered. Because in a case this carefully planned, the evidence is not just what happened. It is a map of how someone thought. Subscribe to Evidence with John so you do not miss any update as this investigation continues to unfold. She had lived in the same house for more than 50 years. That is not a sentimental detail. That is the first thing you need to understand about why Nancy Guthrie was vulnerable in a way that a stranger, with enough time, could identify and exploit. 50 years in one neighborhood means predictable patterns. It means neighbors who are used to seeing the same car, the same lights, the same schedule. It means a home that has not changed much, security systems added over time rather than designed from the ground up, cameras placed where they seemed logical years ago rather than where a trained eye would put them today. Nancy was 84 years old. She needed daily medication. She could not walk more than 50 meters without difficulty. She was not someone who could respond to a physical threat the way a younger or healthier person might. These are not characterizations. These are the confirmed medical facts that matter to this investigation, because they tell us something specific about what kind of person could have selected her as a target, and what kind of planning that selection required. Here is the detail that does not fit a random crime. Nancy had a fixed weekly ritual. Every Sunday morning, she would watch a church service online together with a close friend. Same time, same format, week after week. It is the kind of routine that is invisible to most people and invisible to most threats. But it is exactly the kind of detail that becomes significant when you realize it was the absence from that routine that first raised the alarm. Her friend waited. Nancy did not appear. That call, made sometime Sunday morning on February 1st, was the beginning of the search. Not a call Nancy made, a call made because she failed to show up to something she never missed. Think about what that means. The people closest to Nancy were not alarmed by anything she said or did in the days before she disappeared. There were no distress signals, no unusual behavior, no indication that she felt watched or followed. She had dinner with her daughter Annie on the evening of January 31st. Her son-in-law Tommaso Cioni drove her home. He waited outside until she was safely through the door. He saw her go in. He drove away. And at that moment, by every external measure, everything was fine. The home had cameras. Law enforcement later confirmed that footage from a secondary camera on the fence and near the driveway captured images of regular visitors over time, including a gardening crew and a pool technician. Nothing in that footage was flagged as suspicious, which means whoever came for Nancy that night was not a face that had appeared in that secondary footage, or they knew how to avoid it, or both. What we know is that the front door camera, the one most visible from the street, the one a visitor would immediately notice, was interfered with. A branch was placed over the lens. The camera was manipulated, and according to the FBI, this happened in the early morning hours of February 1st. The question that lingers after you absorb all of this is simple and has no comfortable answer. Nancy Guthrie lived quietly in a home she had occupied for decades. She had a routine that almost no one outside her immediate circle would have known. She had secondary cameras that even law enforcement initially had to review carefully. And yet someone came to her front door prepared with a mask, prepared with a weapon, prepared with a specific backpack, prepared to disable her camera. That level of preparation does not come from a passing glance at a house. It comes from time, and someone had been spending that time watching. January 31st was, by every visible measure, an ordinary Friday evening for the Guthrie family. Nancy left her home at 5:32 in the afternoon, taking an Uber to her daughter Annie's house for dinner. The FBI later reviewed the Uber footage from that ride. There was nothing unusual, no signs of distress, no unusual behavior or conversation, just an 84-year-old woman on her way to have dinner with family, which is exactly what she did. The dinner itself was unremarkable in the way that family dinners are supposed to be. Nancy was with Annie's husband, Tommaso Scioni, in the kind of ordinary evening that does not generate memories because nothing about it signals that it needs to be remembered. When dinner ended, Tommaso drove Nancy home. He pulled up to the house, watched her walk to the door, and waited. This is important. He did not simply drop her at the curb. He waited until she was inside. He confirmed she was in the house. He saw the door close. Then he drove away. The time was 9:48 p.m. That timestamp matters because it is the last externally confirmed moment of Nancy Guthrie being safe inside her own home. What the cameras captured after that is where this investigation becomes something else entirely. While Tommaso was driving home, while Annie was presumably finishing the evening, while the Catalina Foothills neighborhood settled into the quiet of a January night, something was happening at Nancy's front door. The front door camera, the one facing the street, had been tampered with. A branch had been placed over the lens. Whoever did this was not improvising. They were methodical. They had come prepared with the specific intent of eliminating a line of sight. At approximately 2:36 in the morning, a vehicle was recorded by a neighbor's doorbell camera approximately 2.5 miles from Nancy's home. The vehicle was moving fast. The Pima County Sheriff has confirmed that investigators are examining this footage as part of the active investigation. Where that vehicle came from and where it went are questions that remain unanswered. What is not in dispute is the sequence. Nancy was home at 9:48. The front camera was disabled sometime in the early morning hours. A fast-moving vehicle was recorded 2.5 miles away at 2:36 a.m. And when Sunday morning came and Nancy's friend waited for her to join their weekly church viewing, there was no answer. The calls that followed went unanswered. Nancy's wallet was still in the house. Her phone was still in the house. Her daily medication was still in the house. None of the things a person takes when they leave voluntarily were gone. What was present was a detail that law enforcement has confirmed, and that changes the nature of everything that follows. There was blood. It was Nancy's. The question of how this happened inside a house with a security gate that investigators have noted is extremely difficult to breach from the outside is one that the FBI and sheriff have not publicly resolved. But it sits at the center of this investigation like a locked room with the key missing. Someone got in. Someone was prepared. Someone left with an 84-year-old woman who needed daily medication to survive. And by the time anyone knew she was missing, the 48-hour window that the FBI describes as critical in cases like this had already closed. On February 10th, 9 days after Nancy Guthrie disappeared, the FBI Phoenix field office released something to the public. Not a name. Not an arrest, a photograph, and a video clip. The footage was pulled from the doorbell camera at Nancy's front door, the secondary camera that the suspect had not managed to fully disable. What it showed was a figure, a man, based on the FBI's physical analysis, approximately 5 feet 9 to 5 feet 10 inches tall, medium build. He was wearing a mask, he was carrying a weapon, and on his back was a black backpack. That backpack became the center of the FBI's next public communication. 2 days later, on February 12th, the FBI Phoenix account posted a separate image on X, a close-up photograph of the backpack specifically. It was an Ozark Trail 25-liter pack, black, a model sold primarily through Walmart. The sheriff acknowledged that the same model can be found on secondary markets like eBay, but the FBI's decision to single out that bag was not incidental. When investigators isolate a specific piece of equipment and push it publicly, it means they believe someone recognizes it. It means they believe it is a thread. But here is what the footage did not include: a timestamp. The FBI released the image without any attached date or time. The sheriff's office, when pressed on the question of when exactly this footage was captured, said in precise and careful language that any speculation about two different dates is purely speculation. And that statement, measured and deliberate as it was, did not close the door on a question that multiple law enforcement sources had already opened. Because according to reporting by both ABC News and Fox News, citing multiple sources familiar with the investigation, the suspect captured in that footage may not have first appeared at Nancy Guthrie's front door on the night of January 31st. He may have been there before, possibly as early as January 11th, possibly January 24th. If those dates are accurate, if this figure was standing at Nancy's front door 3 weeks before she disappeared, then nothing about this crime is spontaneous. This is not someone who saw an opportunity. This is someone who identified a target, returned to study the property, learned which camera to block and which angle to approach from, and then waited for the right moment. The difference between those two versions of events is not a detail. It is the difference between a crime of chance and a crime of design. And a crime of design asks a question that no press release has answered. How did this person know enough about Nancy Guthrie's home to come back more than once without being noticed? The FBI has not confirmed the earlier dates. The sheriff has not confirmed them. But the sources who describe them to national news outlets are described as familiar with the investigation and the FBI's own behavior. Releasing the image of that backpack as a standalone public appeal suggests they do not yet have what they need. They have a face covered by a mask. They have a backpack. They have footage that may show this person coming back before the night Nancy vanished. And they have DNA from the scene that does not match anything in the National Criminal Database. Subscribe to Evidence with John to follow every development as the investigation continues. The morning of February 2nd, one day after Nancy was reported missing, a Tucson television station received something unusual. KOLD-TV, the local CBS affiliate, received what appeared to be a ransom communication. Investigators asked the station not to disclose the contents. That request was honored. What it established, however, was that by the second day of the investigation, whoever had taken Nancy Guthrie was already making contact, not with law enforcement, with the media. On February 7th, Savannah Guthrie, Nancy's daughter and a host on NBC's Today Show, posted a second public video. In it, she said, and these are her words reported across multiple outlets, "We will pay." She also acknowledged that the family had received messages. She did not elaborate. What she said was enough. The family was in contact with someone. Whether that someone was the actual perpetrator or one of the individuals exploiting the case for financial gain was a question the FBI was simultaneously working to answer, because by February 5th, a man in California had already been arrested for impersonating the kidnapper and attempting to extort the Guthrie family. That arrest was confirmed. He was unrelated to the actual disappearance. This is the forensic and investigative landscape the FBI was navigating in the first 2 weeks. A legitimate ransom communication through a news station, multiple fraudulent ransom attempts, a family under public pressure, and a suspect whose only confirmed identifying features were an approximate height, a build, a mask, and a backpack. Here is what the evidence from the scene itself established in those early weeks. Nancy's wallet, phone, and daily medication were left behind. Her blood was found at the scene, confirmed as hers. The security gate at the property is, according to reporting by News Nation, extremely difficult to breach from the outside, which is a detail that investigators have not publicly resolved, but have also not publicly dismissed. A glove was recovered approximately 2 miles from the home. It contained male DNA. That DNA did not match the National Criminal Database. It also did not match the DNA recovered from inside the house. 2 separate DNA profiles, neither in the system, neither explained. The FBI's response to the DNA evidence was to initiate forensic genetic genealogy analysis, the same methodology that identified the Golden State Killer after decades of failed conventional investigation. This technique does not require the suspect to have a criminal record. It requires only that a biological relative, a parent, a sibling, a cousin, has at some point submitted their DNA to a genealogy database. From that thread, analysts can build a family tree and work toward an identity. It is not fast, but it has worked in cases where nothing else did. Beyond the DNA, investigators were also examining the physical environment around the home. According to reporting by NewsNation and Newsweek, the FBI made inquiries about a vacant property near Nancy's house, asking whether it could have been used as a surveillance point in the days or weeks before she was taken. Construction workers in the area were also questioned. None of these lines of inquiry have produced a public result, but their existence tells you something about how the FBI is reading this crime. They are not looking for someone who wandered past. They are looking for someone who stayed close. More than 55,000 tips had been submitted to investigators by mid-March. The Madres Buscadoras de Sonora, a Mexican organization known for locating missing persons in cross-border cases, joined the search effort, a detail that signals the investigation is not confined to the Tucson city limits. The ransom deadlines involving cryptocurrency payments, at least 2 of them, passed without a confirmed resolution. A former FBI agent, speaking to media, described the ransom theory as becoming less and less likely as the investigation developed. If money was never the actual motive, then what was? That question does not yet have a confirmed answer. What it has is weight. By late February, the investigation had been running for nearly 4 weeks. More than 55,000 tips had been logged, reviewed, and filtered. Federal agents had been on the ground in Tucson since the first days of February, running a command post, coordinating with the Pima County Sheriff, following threads that opened and closed without resolution. And then, around February 25th, something shifted. The FBI began reducing its physical presence in Tucson. The command post that had operated out of the city moved back to Phoenix. Agents remained in the area, but the visible infrastructure of an active search operation began to contract. For the Guthrie family, watching from inside a crisis that had already consumed nearly a month of their lives, that contraction carried a particular weight. For anyone who has followed federal missing persons cases, it carries a different kind of meaning. When the FBI pulls a command post from a field location, it does not mean the investigation is ending. It typically means it is changing shape. The phase that requires boots on the ground, canvassing neighborhoods, interviewing residents, physically searching perimeters, gives way to a phase that happens in laboratories and analytical units. DNA sequencing, database comparisons, genealogy mapping. These are not activities that require a presence at the scene. They require time and precision, but the transition from visible action to invisible process is difficult to explain to a family that is still waiting. It is difficult to explain to a public that has been following every development, and it opened a space for questions that had been building since the first week of the investigation. The Pima County Sheriff was facing a recall effort during this same period, with critics pointing to the handling of the Guthrie case as one of several concerns about the office's communication and transparency. Sheriff Chris Nanos had held press conferences, had confirmed key details, and had also drawn a careful line around information he would not release. That line, in some instances, appeared to diverge from what law enforcement sources were telling national news organizations. The question of when the masked figure first appeared at Nancy's home was one such point of divergence. The sheriff's public position was that speculation about different dates was purely speculation. Sources speaking to ABC News and Fox News described a different picture, one in which the suspect may have been at that property weeks before Nancy vanished. Both things cannot be fully true at the same time. Either the footage is from one visit, or it reflects more than one. Either investigators are working with a single data point, or they are building a pattern. The public does not know which. That gap between what is confirmed and what is reported by credible law enforcement sources is not unique to this case. It is a routine feature of active federal investigations, where releasing too much can compromise the ability to prosecute. But it creates a problem for everyone outside the investigation, trying to understand what is actually known. There is a second unresolved thread that sits beneath the timeline questions: the security gate at Nancy's property. Reporting by NewsNation described it as extremely difficult to breach from the outside. That description has not been publicly confirmed or denied by law enforcement. But if it is accurate, It forces a structural question about the night of January 31st that no press release has addressed. If entry from the street was not easily forced, how did someone get in? Was there a point of access that has not been disclosed? Was something already in place before Tommaso Cioni drove away at 9:48? These are not rhetorical questions. They are the kind of questions that shape the entire theory of how this crime was committed, and they remain open. The DNA recovered from two separate locations continues to be analyzed. The vacant property near Nancy's home, identified through investigative reporting as a potential surveillance point, has not been publicly connected to a suspect. The fast-moving vehicle recorded in the early morning hours of February 1st remains unidentified. Each of these threads is real. Each of them is active, and none of them has closed. If you have any information related to this case, the FBI tip line is 1-800-CALL-FBI. The Pima County Sheriff's Office also maintains an active tip line for this investigation. Evidence. With John keeps both contact numbers in the description of every video covering this case. On February 24th, Savannah Guthrie stood in front of a camera again. Not as a television host, as a daughter. She announced that her family was offering $1 million for information leading to her mother's safe return. At the same time, the family announced a $500,000 donation to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Adults, a commitment made not after a resolution, but in the middle of one of the worst experiences a family can endure. That combination, a reward and a charitable act announced together, said something that no press statement could say directly. It said the family had assessed the situation and decided that public pressure, the kind that only money and media attention can generate, was now their most effective tool. It said the private channels, the messages Savannah had referenced when she told the world, "We will pay," had not produced Nancy. It said they were changing strategy. To understand why that moment is peak 2 in this investigation, you have to go back to what peak 1 established and left unresolved. Peak 1 showed a masked figure at a front door, a backpack isolated by the FBI as a specific public appeal, and credible reporting that this figure may have been there weeks earlier than the night Nancy disappeared. Peak 1 raised the question of how someone could have known enough about Nancy's life to plan this over weeks. Peak 2 answers that question not with a name, but with a structural shift that reveals the full shape of what the FBI is and is not able to do. The forensic genetic genealogy process that investigators initiated is the most powerful tool currently available in cold. In active cases where the suspect has no prior criminal record, it has resolved cases that sat dormant for decades. The Golden State Killer was identified this way after 40 years of failed conventional investigation. But it is not fast. It requires biological material of sufficient quality, database entries from biological relatives, and analytical work that cannot be rushed without producing errors. As of the date of this video, that process is ongoing. The FBI has not announced a result. The 2 DNA profiles recovered from separate locations, one from inside the home and one from a glove found approximately 2 miles away, remain unmatched to any known individual. The fact that those 2 profiles do not match each other has never been publicly explained. Investigators have not stated whether they believe both samples belong to people connected to the crime, or whether one of them may have an innocent explanation. That silence is informative. When the FBI does not eliminate a piece of evidence publicly, it typically means they have not eliminated it internally. The $1 million reward announcement did something else. It recalibrated public attention at a moment when the investigation had become quieter and harder to follow. 55,000 tips had already come in. A California man had already been arrested for fraud. 2 ransom deadlines had passed. A former FBI agent had said publicly that the ransom theory was becoming less likely with each passing week. If money was not the motive, the framework shifts entirely. A crime this carefully planned, against a person this specifically selected, with this level of operational preparation, points towards something other than opportunism. What it points towards specifically, the investigation has not yet said. But the family's decision to spend $1.5 million in a single public announcement, part reward, part legacy, tells you everything about where their hope is directed. Not toward a negotiated return, towards someone, somewhere, who knows something and needs a reason to speak. What the FBI now has, stripped of speculation and limited to confirmed evidence, is this. They have footage of a masked individual at Nancy Guthrie's front door, They have the physical description of that individual. A male, approximately 5 feet 9 to 5 feet 10, medium build, equipped with a specific backpack and a weapon. They have DNA from the scene, currently being analyzed using forensic genetic genealogy. They have a second DNA sample from a glove recovered at distance, a sample that does not match the first and does not appear in any national criminal database. They have more than 55,000 tips, reviewed and ongoing. They have investigative threads pointing toward a vacant property near the home as a possible surveillance location. And they have a family that has committed $1 million to finding answers. What they do not have, publicly, is a name. Forensic genetic genealogy works by finding partial matches in consumer DNA databases, matches that come from relatives who uploaded their own genetic profiles to platforms like GEDmatch, or Family Tree DNA without knowing their information, would one day be part of a federal investigation. From those partial matches, analysts build outward. They construct family trees, generation by generation, and then narrow inward again toward the individual whose DNA was recovered from the scene. It is painstaking. It requires eliminating branches. It requires verifying relationships. And it requires that someone in the suspect's biological family has, at some point, submitted their DNA voluntarily. That last condition is the only thing investigators cannot control. Everything else in the genealogy process is a matter of time and method. The investigation is still open. Agents remain active in the Tucson area despite the command post returning to Phoenix. International search efforts, including the involvement of organizations operating along the U.S.-Mexico border, continue. The physical environment around Nancy's home, including the unidentified vehicle recorded in the early morning hours and the questions surrounding the security gate, has not been publicly resolved. One question remains that no evidence has yet answered, and it is the question this entire case turns on. Someone knew enough about Nancy Guthrie's daily life, her routines, her home, her patterns, to plan this over an extended period without being detected. That knowledge had to come from somewhere. It had to come from someone. The investigation knows this, and whoever that person is, they have left biological evidence at the scene of what they did. There is something specific this case reveals about how predators operate against elderly individuals living alone, and it is worth naming clearly because it applies far beyond Tucson. The preparation described in this investigation, repeated visits to assess a location, the disabling of a visible camera while remaining unaware of a secondary one, the selection of a target whose physical limitations made resistance nearly impossible, reflects a pattern that criminologists call target hardening failure. The visible security measures, the front door camera, the gated entry, were not enough, because they were the measures a casual observer would also notice and plan around. What disrupted the plan, partially, was the secondary camera. The camera on the fence. The camera placed not at the obvious point of entry, but at an angle the suspect did not account for. If there is a single actionable insight from this case, it is this. Visible security deters casual threats. It does not deter someone who has already studied your home. Layered, less obvious monitoring, placed where a visitor would not think to look, is what creates genuine uncertainty for someone planning an approach. What this case also teaches us about the broader system is harder to absorb, but important to say. Nancy Guthrie was 84 years old. She needed daily medication. She lived alone in a home she had occupied for more than half a century. The system around her, the family connections, the community ties, the security infrastructure, was not designed to anticipate a threat this deliberate. That is not a failure of love or of care. It is a structural gap that exists in thousands of communities across this country, wherever aging adults live independently, without the kind of monitoring that would make this kind of crime impossible to execute quietly. This case is not just about one woman. It is about what happens when a highly capable threat meets a gap in the system designed to protect the people most at risk. Nancy Guthrie has been missing for nearly 2 months. The FBI has DNA. They have footage. They have an ongoing genealogy analysis that has broken cases older and colder than this one. The investigation is not closed. It is in its most technical and least visible phase, which is also, historically, the phase that produces results. The question that stays with this case, the one that no press conference has answered and no tip has resolved, is the same one it started with. How did someone get close enough to an 84-year-old woman, in a home she had lived in for 50 years, surrounded by cameras and family and routine, to take her without a single person seeing it happen in real time? That question has an answer. The FBI is working toward it. The next video on Evidence with John will go deeper into forensic genetic genealogy, how it works, what it requires, and why investigators believe it may be the only remaining path to identifying who did this. Subscribe so you are there when that analysis drops, and when this case moves,